We have successfully inserted into the database. Or at least we know that when we created the insertion, it returned a value that was greater than 0. But we won't be 100% certain that we inserted correctly into the database until we read from the database. So during this lecture, we're going to learn how to read from the database. Now, we're going to be reading from the database from the history page, because this is the page that is going to be displaying the list of experiences that the user has added into the database, the ones that we have just added from the new travel page. Besides reading from the database, there is something important that we need to cover in here. And that is that we have to read from the database in the correct moment. We should be reading from the database every time we get navigated to the history page. Because while the user was away from the history page, new elements could have been added or removed or changed from the database. For example, we can navigate for the first time into the history page, and it's okay to try to read the database in the first time. But what happens if we navigate to the new travel page, add new elements, and then go back to the history page? If at that moment we are not reading from the database again, we won't be seeing the new elements. So we need to be reading from the database every time we navigate to the history page. And there is a very handy method that we have available that will do exactly that. This method will execute every single time we navigate back to one page. And this method is a method that we can override. It's a method that comes directly from the page itself. So we can write override and we can search for the onAppearing method. All we have to do is select it and we have overridden it. We don't want to change the base functionality. What we want to do is add to that main functionality. And it is in here where we want to read from the database. Later on, we will learn how to display what we read into the actual interface. Right now, we're just going to be reading from the database. We're going to add a couple of breakpoints so we can know what has been read from the database. And we're going to test this on the simulator. So again, the first thing that we need is the SQLite connection. To be able to use the SQLite connection, we're going to be needing a using directive to the SQLite namespace. So I can add it right away. And so once I've added it, I have access to the SQLite connection. I am going to creating a variable that I'm going to be called con, and this is going to be equal to a new SQLite connection. Remember that the constructor for the SQLite connection is going to require the path of the database, and we can access that path from the app class through the database location variable. And now we have the connection established. Now we also have to create the table, and we're going to be creating the same table that before. And to be able to use the post class, in this case, we want to add a using directive to the travelrecordapp.model namespace. And you may be thinking that we had already created the database previously. But keep in mind that it's very likely that this create table method is going to be called first in the history page, because this is the first page to be displayed once the user has logged in. And it is from this page from where the user may navigate to the new travel page and may eventually add new elements. So it is important that we try to create the post table right away. It doesn't matter if the table was already created, because if it's already created, this execution will just be ignored, nothing will happen. It's not going to be replaced by a new instance of the table, it's simply going to be ignored, but if the table does not exist, it will create it. So in case it doesn't exist, we just add this call to the create table and tell it that the table that it's going to create is the post table. And through the connection, there is also a method that is called table. And this is the one that will allow us to get the table. This is also a generic method, which means that we have to establish what type are we going to be working with. In this case, the post type. So this method is going to go to the database and return a table query object with the post table. But the table query object is not something we can work with very easily. What we really need is a list that will make things easier for us to work with C# and with all of the elements that are being read from the database. To be able to turn the table query into a working list, we are going to need the system.link namespace, which is probably already referenced in a using directive. And with that, we can go to this line and after getting that table query, call the toList method. This method, as its name suggests, is going to turn that table query into a list in this case of post elements. This means that a list of post objects are going to be inside of what this method is going to return. And so what we can do is create a new variable that is going to be called posts, and that is going to be equal to whatever this method is going to return, which is all of the post elements that are inside of the post table in the database as a list. And finally, don't forget to close the connection to the database. So we call the close method from the con object. And that's it. This is how you read from the database. Now, right now, we're not going to be displaying the list into the interface just yet. What we can do is add a breakpoint right after getting the posts. So when our execution hits this breakpoint, we can come back to Visual Studio, hover over this variable, and take a look at what value has been assigned to it. So I am going to run this on the simulator. I will have to log in, so this onAppearing method will be executed as soon as we navigate to the history page, and we will see if the table is being correctly read. And if it is, we'll also be needing to check if the insertion that we made was actually successful. So the first thing that I have to do is log in. Once I do it, notice that in fact we have hit the breakpoint. This means that it is correct that the onAppearing method is being executed. So I'm going to head back to Visual Studio. This breakpoint means that all of the lines before it have been executed, so I can hover over the posts variable, and we can see that its count is equal to 1, meaning that this is a list that has one element inside of it. And we can right-click on this and select Quick Watch to take a look at what this variable has in it. And so we can start expanding the values, and we see that it has in the 0 position one post element. In this column, we see the value, and over here we can see the type. And we can see that indeed this is of type post. And if we expand this section, we can see the experience and the ID. The experience value is pretty straightforward. It's just going to have whatever the user wrote down in the entry. But the ID, notice that since this is the first element to be inserted into the database, it has a value of 1. That has been assigned automatically because we set a SQL attribute of auto increment. This is also going to act as a primary key as well. And because of that, ID is never going to be null and is always going to be different. Now what I want to do is continue with the execution. And notice what happens if I go to add a new element. Right now I'm on another page. And if I write something down and I save it, it's supposed to be saved now into the database. So the database is different than the first time. The good thing is that because we are using the onAppearing method, when I navigate back, this method is executed again. So the database is being read again and it should be updated. So if we go to the posts variable, we can see that the count is now 2. And if we start expanding it, we see that in fact we see 2 posts inside of this list. And the second one is the one that is going to have the word that I just wrote down in the entry, and the ID again has automatically been incremented by 2. We have already learned how to read from the database. But right now, we have a small issue when it comes to closing the connection. It happens, and it happens very often, that you forget to close the connection. So when you want to establish the connection again, you get errors. In the next lecture, we're going to learn how we can prevent this by learning about an interface that the SQLite connection class is implementing that is called iDisposable.